Our topic for today's webinar is Utah's experiment in saving lives. I'm Bill Lemons, the moderator for today. I'm the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor for the state of Minnesota. And I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors of today's webinar, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Minnesota Department of Health, the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, and the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I'd like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the TZD website. All attendees are muted. PDFs of the PowerPoints will be available on the Minnesota TZD website, as well as a PDH form for continuing education credits and a recording of the webinar, of today's webinar, if you want to go back and watch it again, or you have somebody else that might be interested in watching it. Video and audio for all participants are turned off, but you can communicate with the speakers and other participants using the chat and Q&A boxes at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat feature to introduce yourself, share ideas with all participants, or to let us know if you're having AV or IT issues. There will be a couple of times throughout the presentation where we prompt some discussion and ask a few questions through the chat box, so please share your ideas. We encourage interaction and discussion through the chat. Note that you can send a chat to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. You can also use the Q&A feature if you have a question for one of our speakers. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A, and there'll also be plenty of time at the end of the presentations for Q&A. Our first speaker is Tyson Skeen. Tyson was selected as the Utah Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor in 2016. He has a bachelor's degree from the Utah Valley University and is a graduate of the law school at the University of Utah. During law school, he clerked for the criminal division at the U.S. Attorney's Office, District of Utah, and the criminal division of the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office. He practiced as a defense attorney at the Utah County Public Defenders Association and as a prosecutor for Salt Lake City, and as the unit chief for the city of West Jordan. Since becoming Utah's TSRP, Tyler has trained thousands of prosecutors, police officers, judges, and other traffic safety partners. Our other speaker today is Jared Cornea, Sergeant Jared Cornea. Sergeant Cornea is a 14-year veteran of the Utah Highway Patrol and is currently assigned to the training section as the Breath Alcohol Supervisor, DRE State Coordinator, and Honor Guard Commander. Sergeant Cornea received a bachelor's degree from Webster State University and is currently working on a master's degree in public administration from Southern Utah University. He is a graduate of Northwestern University School of Police Staff and Command and a United States Marine Corps veteran. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyson and Jared.
Thanks, Bill. As Bill said, we're happy to be here to talk about Utah's experiment with 05 and how things are going and how we got there. And as he said, if there's any questions anybody has, put them in the Q&A. We will have time at the end for questions and answers, but we're happy to answer questions along the way as well. So without further ado, we're going to get going into our presentation here today. So as Bill said, Tyson Skeen is my name, Jared Cornea, Sergeant Jared Cornea. He'll be speaking to us here momentarily. That's our contact information. If everybody will have access to these slides, so you'll have that. Feel free to reach out to us later if you have any questions. Jared is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to impaired driving issues, and I kind of just ride his coattails as much as I can. So When it comes to this 05 issue, you look at our national stats and you look at how many people we were killing in DUI related fatalities across America back in the 1980s. And that's when everybody was at a 1.0 per se level when it came to BACs per se levels. And we were killing a lot of people. We're still killing a lot of people, but we're killing a lot more then than we are now. And over the years, as things have changed and cultural changes have happened, we see that number has come down significantly, but it's still at a number that is unacceptable. That 10,000 that we hover around across the country every year is unacceptable, and we shouldn't accept it. And it's kind of plateaued as you see that as it goes through. There's been a lot of discussions on how to change that plateau, how to get it to keep going down. There was a think tank here in Utah that for several years prior to our implementation of the 05 law in 2017 in Utah, or the passing of the 05 law in 2017, they for years had been experimenting with legislation to deal with 0.05 as a BAC. And early that year in 2017, they got a group together. I was a part of that. There were some other people, and they were just brainstorming, and they wanted to know what options were available. And they kept coming up with ideas, and then they'd send the experts, the people that really knew how things happen when the rubber hit the road, to go out and see what would happen if we did this. You know, things just like driver license consequences, not criminal, but just driver license consequences, or administrative consequences, or other things that would go along if somebody was at an 05, in addition to our DUI law here in Utah. And every single thing that the group came up with, we hit roadblocks. Your laws are probably very similar to Utah, where the DUI law is intertwined with so many other things, with the driver license division and codes there and administrative processes and everything else, that every time we tried to run a bill or an idea through its course, we'd hit roadblocks, and it just wasn't working. And then finally, we were meeting with a legislative sponsor, and one of the people in the room just said, well, why don't we just make it per se 05? And there was only about 4 or 5 people in the room at that time. And the legislative sponsor says, well, what would that do? And they looked at me, and I said, it would just simply change our per se level. It wouldn't impact any of these other things we've had troubles with. So we left the meeting, didn't know what was going on. Later that year, a draft came out, and the only change he was making was changing 0.08 in our code. Everywhere it said 0.08 to 0.05. And it had stiff opposition from the beverage industry, from others. Some people who we thought might be advocates for it were not at the time. And it was an uphill battle. But really, Representative Norm Thurston is the legislator who ran this bill. He did a great job with data, and data wins the day on this issue. We don't have a lot of data in the United States on this, but there's plenty of data all around the world when it comes to this. And so when we start talking about why do we need to reduce the per se level of a BAC from an 08 to an 05 across the country, and you can see that crash risk goes up. There have been multiple independent studies. This is something that has been studied quite a bit around the country, or around the world, not necessarily the United States, but around the world, where crash risk goes up significantly at 05. We don't have to get to an 08 or these higher level BACs before our crash risk really goes up. When we start looking at the effects on somebody at even at an 02, decline in visual function, decline in ability to perform 2 tasks at the same time, or divided attention tasks. This is what those 2 things alone seem pretty important when it comes to driving. We don't want our visual function decreased. We certainly don't want our ability to divide attention decreased, because driving is a divided attention task. When we get to 05, we have reduced coordination, reduced ability to track moving objects, difficulty in steering, reduced response time. And so all these things are the why we need this, what benefit it's going to have. One thing that we need to keep in mind is this idea of 05 is not a new idea. I think people get freaked out anytime there's change, but our CDL drivers already have an 04 as their per se level when it comes to driving. And we need to ask ourselves why. Why would it be okay for me to drive a car at 07, but for a CDL driver to not be able to drive at 04? It's because they're not safe to be able to do so, and we know that. And so we've taken action in regards to that. Pilots are the same. If somebody was in an 05, we want to jump on a plane with a pilot, fly across the country. I'm guessing you wouldn't. I know I wouldn't. Pilots have, if you take one sip, they're out of service for 8 hours minimum. And so they're basically zero tolerance. And we need to ask ourselves why. And the clear answer is because it's simply not safe. It's not safe to fly an airplane under any level of influence of alcohol. And that goes for driving as well. Some of the main opposition, and what I'm going to focus on a lot before I turn the time over to Jared to give you a law enforcement perspective, is some of the opposition and the myths that we had to battle in Utah when it came up to. And one of our local papers took great interest in this issue, and they posted almost weekly stories trying to combat it. And they were very much against this, and took a position as a paper that they were going to oppose this. And they had one writer in particular who wrote pretty extensively on this topic throughout our process. And this was an article that just made me laugh. The skier spends up to $15,000 to bring his family to Utah for Christmas. He says with the new tough drunken driver law, he won't be back next year. And so I sit here and I think we're going to lose $15,000 of tourism, which Utah is not hurting for tourism. But we're going to make our roads safer. So to me, that seems like a very, very good trade when it comes to that. This was a further quote from him when he says, it's an incentive not to come here. If I have to choose between possibly getting a DUI and going to another state, I'm going to another state. It's too risky. Now, when I look at that, this is somebody who tells me he's bringing his family to our state to ski and to recreate and to do that. And he's going out to dinner with his family and then putting his family in a car after having drank alcohol at dinner and then going around and driving. And he thinks our law is the one that's too risky. This is kind of some of the nonsense really that we got when it came to this. A couple other quotes from other articles. It's not worth it. You are now a criminal for having a beer or having a beer at dinner or a glass of wine. And we all know that's not true. You can have a beer or a glass of wine at dinner and not be a criminal. You become a criminal when you choose to get behind the wheel of your car impaired. We have this, it's draconian, it's fascist, it's culty. And again, just so much opposition from certain industries when it came to this. But the one thing that they weren't ever talking about was public safety. They were talking about, oh, what's it going to mean to me if I want to go out and have a beer and then go drive? Or what's it going to mean to me if I want to go skiing and have a beer on the slopes or do any of these other things? And the reality is we need to get back to this cultural change. We need to get back to a cultural change where simply it's not okay to drink and drive at any level. And so this change to an 05 per se level for BAC was a step in that direction for the state of Utah. I had a senator who had been very outspoken against this law approach me, and I'm not a lobbyist. I'm just there. People can ask me questions and I answer questions. I don't lobby for legislation one way or another. But he came and he asked me, he said, if drinking and driving is so dangerous, why don't we just make everybody alcohol restricted drivers? And I said, that sounds perfect to me. Write the bill. And I don't think that was the response he was looking for. But it's one of those things where we really do need to have another cultural change. There was a major cultural shift from the 80s through the 2000s that reduced our road fatalities. And now we've plateaued again. And now we're looking at having another major cultural shift so that we can save more lives as we move forward. Again, that's that goal right there that you see. When it comes to these DUI crashes, every single one of them are preventable. And every one of them is preventable by somebody simply making the decision that I've consumed a substance that's going to not work with me very well while I drive. So I'm going to choose not to drive. And that's where we need to get people here. So let's talk about some of the myths and some of the things that people came up with, and we can show you some of the experiences we've had in Utah. But essentially, this was there were several things that, and I wasn't around in the early 80s when the 10 to 08 change started happening. Coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, Utah was also the first state to go from a 10 to an 08 per se BAC. The state of Oregon did it the same year, but I always tell my counterparts in Oregon we did it first. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm going to claim it anyways. But I was not around for those fights. That was way before my time as an attorney or being involved in any of this. But I was able to speak to some people and read some of the news articles and other things that at the time people were saying. And it's odd to me that almost all of the arguments that were used back then were used again this time. Why we shouldn't go from a 1.0 to an 0.8 is exactly why we shouldn't have gone from an 0.8 to an 0.5. The first is the standardized field sobriety tests are not validated at an 0.5. I don't know that this is really that big of a deal, but this is a thing we hear a lot. Well, how are officers going to be able to detect 0.5 drivers? And Jared will talk a little bit more about this, so I don't want to dive too much into it. But we're not asking our officers to detect 0.5 drivers. We're asking our officers to find and arrest impaired drivers. And the standardized field sobriety tests don't need to change for them to continue to look for impaired drivers. But with that, when you look at the NHTSA manual, it has two studies, the Colorado study from 1995 and the San Diego study from 1998, that both actually look at standardized field sobriety testing at an 0.4 and an 0.5 level. And so while it hasn't been validated or officially validated yet, and we're moving away from that word validation anyways, they certainly have studied, they've looked at it, and those tests have shown to be sensitive down to an 0.4 and an 0.5 level. And so I think we will see movement as we do this. Keep in mind that the official validation study out of Florida wasn't done until 1997. And over 15 states had already adopted the 0.8 per se level when it came to that. And so we're not going to see major studies probably done. If Utah's the only state that ever does this, we're not going to see big national studies done on the standardized field sobriety tests. They'll do it when it needs to be done. We have some anecdotal experiences here in the state with, we use our wet labs to evaluate participants near an 0.5. They actually did a wet lab for the legislative committee who was considering this bill during the interim. When they were not in session, they brought the committee in and had them participate. They didn't have them drink. They had other people drink. But out of all the drinkers in the two different wet labs that they did, there was only one that said that when they had drank the level that they knew they'd be about an 0.5, every single one of those people said, I would not drive a car right now. And these weren't plants. These were just people. And they had no idea what their BAC was going to be. And then they put them on the intoxilizer and found out what the BAC would be. The one who said he would drive was at an 0.2. So he was much lower than the others. The others were all around 0.45, 0.5 in that area. And they all were saying they would not drive at that level. Another myth is that if we do this, we're only going to punish responsible drinkers. And I heard that so many times, and that became such a burr in my saddle, I guess, so to say, because it just is patently false. Responsible drinkers don't drive. And that's the reality of the situation. If somebody's going to have a drink at a party, at dinner, at a bar, whatever they want to do, that's fine. But it is not the responsible thing then to go get behind the wheel of a car, ever. That's just not going to be the responsible way to drink. And so when I hear that, the thing I can just say is that's just simply false. We are not having responsible drinkers that go drink and then go get behind the wheel of their car. That's very, very irresponsible. We need to keep in mind that people are impaired at an 0.5. Crash risk goes up between 4 to 10 times by the time you hit from 0.5, by the time you hit 0.8, and it's not responsible for them to be doing that. And so again, it's that cultural change that we're looking for, to be able to really emphasize that if you're drinking, just don't drive. The myth 3, the focus will change from those that are the most dangerous to the lower levels. So meaning we're going to stop focusing on the people who are at those high level BACs, and we're just going to start arresting those that are at an 0.5. And again, goes back to something I mentioned a few minutes ago. We're not changing how we're doing anything. Again, I don't want to steal Jared's thunder here because he's going to talk a great deal about that, but we're not telling our officers to do anything differently. We're looking for impaired drivers. That's it. And if they're an 0.5, if they're a 1.5, if they're a 2.7, if they're a 4.3, they're impaired and we want them off the road. And so they're looking for impaired drivers. They're not doing anything different. And Jared can go into much more detail on that. Average DUI arrest in Utah is approximately a 1.5. We kind of bounce between a 1.5 and a 1.6 depending on the year. But that's been pretty steady, and that's actually pretty close to the national average as well. The national average is right around a 1.6 when it comes to BAC for DUI and DWI offenses. This isn't changing that, and I'll show some numbers here in a minute that show how few of our arrests are 05 to 079, but it's not changing that. That number has stayed static for the last few years, even since we dropped our per se level. One other thing that, and as you talk with people, you hear there are certain words that become kind of a faux pas for people. In my world, the TSRP community, if you say a DUI accident, it makes our skin crawl because we know those aren't accidents; those are crashes, they're collisions. They're not accidents. I have developed a real hating for the term legal limit, and the media uses it, courts use it in their written opinions. We use it as prosecutors, police use it, everybody uses it, and we need to quit using it because it's actually not true. When we say the legal limit in Utah was dropped from an 08 to an 05, that just simply isn't true. Somebody could have always got a DUI under an 08 before if they were incapable of safely operating their vehicle, if they were impaired, and we could prove that. And so when we say legal limit, it tells somebody I can drink up to that level. I can have a drink and I can drink up to an 08, or I can drink up to an 05 and I'm fine. As long as I'm an 079, that's the legal limit, right? I'm under that legal limit. And that again is a cultural change I would like to see, is us quit using that term legal limit, because I suspect your laws are similar to Utah's, where it's possible to get a DUI under that per se level. And that's what I like to call it, as a per se level rather than a legal limit. When it comes to the focus will change, here is the arrests comparison of BACs from 05 to 079 in the state of Utah. Now, 2017 is when this bill passed. It did not go into effect until the very end of December 2018. And so 2018 was spent an entire year before this law passed. And our DUI arrests where somebody had a BAC of 05 to 079 was just over 2% of our DUI arrests in 2018, the last year before this law went into effect. You see it went up just a little bit, 3.7, 4.6, 3.6, and now it's back down last year to that. And these are state fiscal years. These aren't calendar years. That's why I'm able to get it. Our fiscal year ended at the end of June. So that's why I have those 2022 numbers. It's a fiscal year. But you can see that that number has stayed pretty static. We're not climbing. We're not arresting all the lower level BACs. We're arresting pretty much the same number of those people as we always have when it comes to comparison to our overall DUIs. But we really are still just arresting the same people, those 1.5s, that average. We still get our crazy high 3.7s, 4.1s, 4.2s every once in a while that pop up. But that 1.5 to 2.0 area is really kind of the hot spot of where we're still arresting a ton of people. One other myth that was talked about when it came to this bill is that the courts are going to get filled with all these extra DUI cases, that they're not going to be able to keep up because we're dropping that per se level, so it's going to bring in all these new DUI cases, and people are going to have way more cases in the courts, and the courts aren't going to be able to keep up. These are our DUI arrest numbers in the state of Utah each year, and these are calendar year. That's why I don't have 2022. But you can see that we are pretty much consistent across the board when it comes to this level. We kind of do a little bit of ebb and flow right around that 10,000 to 10.5 mark pretty consistently when we're talking about that. What that tells me is that we're maxed out. With the resources that we have in the state of Utah to do DUI enforcement, this is the number of people that we can arrest. Now, if you gave us 500 more officers across the state, that number could increase. If you gave us, a bunch more resources to be able to go out and target DUI drivers, that number could increase. But with the resources that we have currently available, that's our number. We're getting everybody that we can get, and it has stayed consistent when it comes to that. So it's really not filling the courts with any more numbers, as you see there. We had a little bit of a drop in 2019. but it's right back up to consistent where it is. And there are things that happen, obviously, in 2019, 2020 that kind of changed our world and where we're at. This is really, when it comes to it, this is the why. And when we're talking about DUIs and why do we spend so much time focusing on them, talking about them, studying them, training about them, this right here is the why. And every number that you see on the screen in yellow represents somebody who was killed in a DUI crash. These are only alcohol. These do not have alcohol and drugs or other drugs, controlled substances. These are only alcohol-related deaths in the state of Utah each year. Now, our DUI levels in Utah are comparatively very low to other states around the country. And that has to do with a lot of different factors. As a state, we're not big drinkers anyways. And so our rates are low as it is. But as I stated earlier, they're still unacceptable because every single one of those numbers that's in yellow is a preventable death. None of them were accidental. Every one of them could have been prevented if somebody would have just made the conscious decision that when I had something to drink, I'm not going to get behind the wheel of my car and drive. I'm going to take Uber. I'm going to take Lyft. I'm going to take a taxi. I'm going to have a designated driver. I'm going to walk. I'm going to take the bus. I'm going to do anything. Essentially, what this is we have to get these numbers down to 0. And until we do, that no longer is an acceptable number. And so this is the why. This is why we keep doing it. This is why we keep talking about it. Until those numbers are down to 0, we have work to do. And Utah's 05 BAC law is a really good start to that. And I think it would be a really good start for everybody to adopt and to see. But it is not the end all be all. It's not, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. But we got to keep educating. We got to have those cultural changes. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Jared, and we'll be around for some question and answer as well.
Well, thank you, Tyson. Trying to get this to share. There we go. Tyson had a lot of numbers that were out there, and I'll go into some of those as well. But we do have, and I can't get my, hold on. I apologize. I'm a novice at Zooms, so.
And then go to display settings, Jared.
Yeah, it's hidden by
That's the hard part, isn't it?
Jared,
I can
move your cursor up a little higher, up just a smidgen higher up. I'm going to try and help you get to the display settings.
Yeah, it's hidden by the toolbar from Zoom.
Oh, can you move the toolbar?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. It's not letting me move it. There we go. Okay. So I'll talk about kind of what the things that we saw as far as law enforcement, our perspective on this. A lot of it was the same with me and Tyson on the things that we saw. I was involved early on in this whole process as well. So we've worked a lot on this together. We've done this presentation several times as well. And what we had to do as far as our perspective was in part of that law. So really the things that changed in the law, they changed the per se level from 08 to 05. So that was a big change in that House bill. And they also put a mandate in there that every officer in the state needed to be basically retrained or refreshed. We had to do refreshers on the current field sobriety tests, DUI investigation techniques, things like that. So that was the only other real change in the law. So they just changed a couple of things, just tweaked it a little bit, but it was a big impact and different things that we had to do on what was coming up. So as far as my crew, there's 8 of us total in the state that are in charge of the DUI training. So we had a lot of education that we needed to do to take out to all the agencies out there. So that was a big responsibility and a big thing that we had to do. There's about 9,500 or so, roughly, police officers in Utah. So we were in charge of training all those people. So we looked at doing in-person classes, and that was just not going to be feasible with the amount of people that I had to do those classes. So online, we did some online classes that we offered through our post portal. We have an online thing that people can log in and do it that way. And for the Highway Patrol, we made it part of our yearly in-service training. So we taught roughly 20 to 30 classes for just the state patrol and trained all our officers. The problem with this approach was that we couldn't really track the other agencies. So we could only track our agency on the training that we got. We could track through the online portal at post, but if another agency, pulled one of our instructors in, or they had an SFST instructor, we couldn't track those numbers. So that was the difficult part of the training mandate. But we were able to get a lot of the training out there and offer that as far as updates. So part of that mandate that we were able to accomplish was, I would change a little bit, was the tracking that we weren't able to do. So if you guys are able to implement this in your state or other states, I would strongly encourage some kind of a tracking mechanism to see and ensure everybody got the training that they were mandated by the legislature. So some of the things that we taught. So as far as field sobriety, there's nothing new out there. It's still the same stuff that's offered by NHTSA since 2018. So we didn't have anything new to train people on. We mostly focused on a refresher, because a lot of agencies aren't doing DUIs regularly as far as their patrol officers. So they might, do a handful of DUIs a year. The State Patrol does a lot more of that, so we're a little more proficient at it, but it should be a part of year-to-year, monthly training, depending on the agency and your assignment. So we didn't have anything new to offer as far as that goes with the 05 change. So we went with what we had with the NHTSA manual from 2018 and the curriculum that they had there. One thing we did focus on was the validated clues. So they're obviously with the NHTSA standards now, they're validated at that 08 level with what we're teaching. So with the 05 per se level that we changed to, it was, hey, focus on these. If you're seeing these minimum number of clues that are associated with the field sobriety tests, then you're going to be good, because you're going to be above that 05 level that we have right now as far as our per se. So it was good for the officers, and we focused on that. If you're seeing those minimum number of clues with the field sobriety, then you're good to go as far as making that arrest. So as far as what we're currently teaching, we're still doing the same thing. Obviously, the NHTSA curriculum hasn't been updated. It's still the same. They've been talking about changes coming out and updates coming out for a while now. We just haven't seen those. A lot of those are due to COVID related delays and things like that, and curriculum updates and being able to revise things. So that's part of the problem. I know that they're coming. They've been promising them, so hopefully they'll come soon. But I don't anticipate any big changes, honestly. So there hasn't been any new studies or any new validations that they've done. So it'll be a lot of the same curriculum, I believe. They won't make any significant changes to it. So we're going to continue to teach the same things that we have been teaching. Obviously, the per se changed for us. That was really the only change in the law other than the training mandate. And we have been approached by several entities about doing studies here. So we haven't really looked at that. NHTSA did do a study with the change that we did, and I'll get into that a little bit more. They followed us from prior to when the law came into effect. They passed it in 2017, didn't go into effect until the end of 2018. So there's basically a year and a half. So they grabbed our data and our numbers and looked at what was happening in that time period, and then they followed it for the year after that. So I'll dive into that a little bit more. So there has been a study by NHTSA, and like Tyson mentioned, our arrests that we're teaching our officers to do are based on impairment that they're seeing. So it's not a number we're focusing on. If you have an impaired individual, we're teaching our officers to make that arrest. So whether that's alcohol or drugs or a combination of those substances. So as far as law enforcement, our job hasn't really changed. I guess people could look at the argument that, hey, it's easier to arrest people now with a lower per se. And if the officers are focusing on the way that we train them to arrest based on impairment, and then they get the number later on, because their probable cause for that arrest is not based off of a number, because they don't know that number when they're making that arrest. They might have a preliminary breath test or something, but if it's a drug arrest, or they're seeing a combination of a low alcohol number and impairment caused by drugs, they're not going to know what those substances are. So if they're focusing on the field sobriety test and the clues and the investigation, the 3 phases of the DUI investigation with the vehicle in motion and the personal contact of the driver, and then those field sobriety tests, then their probable cause is based on what they're seeing in that investigation. I don't know how it is in Minnesota, but we can't talk about PBT numbers in our courts in Utah. So if they're arresting based off of that, I would highly encourage them to arrest based off the probable cause they've developed in their investigation, and not those preliminary numbers. And that's what you're going to be able to testify in court is the probable cause you've developed in your investigation. So as far as easier to arrest, I guess it could be looked at that way, because the field sobriety tests are validated at 08 and our per se levels in 05. But as far as more arrests, we haven't really changed anything. Tyson put the numbers up. We've averaged the same ever since I've been a trooper. They've remained right around the 10,000 mark. I think the highest I ever saw was maybe 2010 or 11. We had about 12,000 something arrests, but we've averaged right around about the same amount. So in order to change that, we have to do a few different things. So as far as the effects on us, I did see some changes right away with this law, even when it wasn't in effect. So the legislature passed it in 2017. They meet in the spring. So we basically had a year and a half before the law actually went into effect. And that was the time frame we had to get everybody trained up and educate, and not just the law enforcement, prosecutors, different things like that, courts, but we had to educate the public on this. The media was involved, but we didn't do a huge education campaign either. It wasn't, from our perspective, we didn't put a lot of stuff into it, but I did notice I would go out and work a DUI shift. And even after the law was passed, but not in effect, I noticed a big change in people's behavior. So I could go out and stop 2 or 3 cars and I could find a DUI. But after this law had passed but not gone into effect, I would have to go out and stop 15 or 20 cars to find that same DUI where I could stop 2 or 3 prior to this. So I did notice an immediate change, and that wasn't just me, that was everybody that I had talked to as well, had noticed those same differences in people's habits. So we noticed an immediate change as far as that goes. The average DUI arrest in Utah has stayed the same. That hasn't really changed. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I would hope that it would go down because people's behavior is changing. But I think part of that is officers don't have the confidence if they're not practicing and trained in those field sobriety tests, that unless they see really a lot of clues and see a lot of impairment, they're still hesitating to make that arrest. So if they can focus on those numbers are seeing, because our per se is at 05, then they can make those arrests at lower numbers where people are still impaired. They don't have to be that fall down drunk in order to make that arrest. It's easier, I think, also for our prosecutors and our courts to make those convictions. So I did see some changes there. The prosecutors have enjoyed, I think, the lower number. It makes it easier for them, because I don't testify a lot in court on DUIs. I think it's easier for our prosecutors to make those plea bargains and things like that. And obviously, I think they only do that with, first-time offenders and things like that. If they have multiple offenses, then obviously they're doing things differently. But it's made it easier for them as far as prosecution and things like that, and easier for the courts and convictions and those things associated with that. We have a new law that was also a big benefit to us here that passed just last year. They changed our refusal law. So if someone was arrested for DUI and they refused any chemical tests, it was only driver license sanctions at that point. So it was all civil, and they changed our law last year. They passed a new one where if a driver that's arrested for DUI and they refuse the chemical tests, the officer gets a warrant that's approved, then they are convicted. They can get charged with that refusal. So it's now a criminal offense, and they can get convicted of that. And it is equal to the DUI charge, whatever that original DUI charge would have been. The refusal is now also available to the prosecutors and those officers to charge with. So it's helped us as far as convictions that way as well, and given some teeth to that law. And we did have some of the issues surrounding that you probably saw with some of our phlebotomists and blood draws and things like that. So I think that's where that law came into effect. We didn't want to put a nurse or a firefighter or someone that's not law enforcement in that position, because we do have a lot of law enforcement phlebotomists that do the blood draws for us. So we didn't want someone that wasn't law enforcement to be put in that position where, you know, confrontation or physical, something might happen. So that refusal law has been great for us. We actually have had a few cases come through court and they have found them guilty on that. So that is getting established very well. Some other effects on law enforcement. So Tyson mentioned we don't have a lot of, comparatively to other states, Utah doesn't have a lot of alcohol consumption, whether that's through our demographics, religion, different things like that. Our population doesn't tend to drink as much alcohol, but they do still have a lot of drug use. So we've seen a big increase, and I know it's nationwide. Our alcohol DUIs have gone down, and comparatively, they've always been low, but our drug DUIs have gone up. They've skyrocketed. Our fatal crashes with drugs, I think are about double. I don't have the current numbers, but they're probably double. We have fatals related to drug impairment than we do with alcohol. So that's something that we need to focus on more, that we've seen a lot of. And I know that's nationwide. That's not just specific to Utah. So a lot of the cannabis and different things that have becoming more prevalent have increased those numbers, and we're seeing that especially in the surrounding states. So we're medicinal here in Utah. A lot of the states around us are recreational, and there's been a lot of studies and things like that that have shown increases in crashes and fatals related to drugs. And we see a lot of combinations. People will use alcohol in a combination with another drug too. So that's another thing that we have noticed as far as law enforcement. But it has made our job a little bit easier with that 05, giving us a little more teeth and a little more tools to try to enforce these different things. So that's where our training is specific on, obviously, the DRE program and the A-RIDE and different things like that we can offer to officers to help them focus on impairment related to alcohol, drugs, anything that someone's consuming regarding DUI enforcement. So as far as 05, Tyson mentioned this as well. These are just rough numbers that I searched on Google, so nothing specific. Don't take these as gospel, but there's about 195 countries in the world, and about 100 of those countries are at that 05 level or below. So we're not the first definitely to do this. There's plenty of research, there's plenty of information out there, there's plenty of studies to back up moving to this 05 that show people are impaired at that level, and they shouldn't be operating a vehicle at that level. US, as far as fatal crashes, we're not number one in the world. So the US is about number 3 as far as DUI fatal crashes and percentage wise. South Africa, and I believe it was Canada, are ahead of us in those numbers. So it's still nothing to be proud of. We're still on the podium as far as that goes, as far as DUI fatal crashes. And so we need to lower that. As far as ways that we can lower that, as far as the history of this, the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, in 2013, they made this recommendation that states should drop to that 05 level. And it obviously took Utah, till 2017 to pass the law, 2018 for it to go into effect. So we're talking 5-ish years from when NTSB recommended. And the reason they do that, they don't make these recommendations to have more arrests made or to get people in trouble or get convictions. They make these recommendations because it's based on research, it's based on data that shows that if you do these things that they're recommending, that your fatal crash numbers will go down. And we saw that with the 08 to change when it went from 1.0 to 08 in the early 80s. So every time that they have changed that BAC level, they've seen a reduction in fatal crashes by about 10 to 12%. So that's what they recommended. And from 1983, the last state to finally drop to that 08 level was Delaware, and they did that in 2004. So you're talking a 20-year time frame for all of the states in the nation to do that. So we're expecting other states to obviously drop down to this. And we saw that when we first went to 08 or 05, that there were several states that contacted us, hey, how did you get this to happen? Tyson went through very well and explained kind of how he did it. And it was from us, with law enforcement, we didn't have a lot of input on this. We said, yeah, this is a good idea. And the legislature took it, and we were a little bit surprised, honestly, when it actually passed. And then we're like, well, what do we do now? So, but if you can get your legislature and different things on board and show them the data and the numbers and the reasons why, that's kind of how it happened here. So it was actually a good thing. So that's the kind of the ways that we can get these things to go down, is behavior change in people. So is this the answer? Obviously, we had to do some education, some training with our officers, and that was where we had to start with. Obviously, the public, we needed to educate them as well. So it wasn't just us, the officers. We can't arrest ourselves out of this problem. There's not enough of us, number one. There's a lot of other stuff that we are focused on as well, not just DUI enforcement. We can give overtime shifts out as much as we want through our highway safety office, and they do a great job, but there's just only so many officers that can go out there. So we can't change this problem that we're facing just by making more arrests and offering more overtime. If we can hire more officers, like Tyson mentioned, that would obviously put a dent in it, but that's still not the answer to that problem. So the change in behavior is the biggest thing. So I compare this to when I was younger, smoking was a lot more popular. And since then, it's changed over the last, 50 years. In the early 50s and things, that in 1940s, they had cigarettes that they offered in the rations for the troops, and everybody thought it was okay to do it. But over time, as more information came out about it and the problems associated with it, there's a stigma attached to it. Obviously, if you smoke, you got to go somewhere else and do it now. You can't do it out in public and different things like that, or on airplanes where you used to be able to. So society got behind that, and there was a huge movement to change people's behavior as far as smoking. So something like that, we obviously have a lot of programs in place, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, different things like that are focused on that. But in order to change this behavior and make a bigger dent, the society needs to get more behind that as far as helping to change that behavior. So it would have to be something similar to smoking that happened in the past. So our DUI numbers remain roughly the same. So nothing has really changed with that. We're kind of business as usual. Like Tyson mentioned, we're kind of maxed out. That's kind of where we are, and we can't really affect that a whole lot. We can do it, specific areas if we do a DUI blitz or do a checkpoint or something. So we can have effects when we do those, but roughly statewide, it's going to remain about the same. So as far as fatal crashes, so what did we see when this law went into effect? So 2019, we saw a big number. We saw a huge drop in fatal crashes related to alcohol. So that obviously changed right away. So since then, Utah is a fast growing state. And I know compared to some other states, we're probably don't seem like we have a lot. We're roughly 3.3 or something million right now, but that has changed. So, and it's constantly changing. We've gone up roughly 400,000 or so people in the last year or two. So our population is increasing. So that means our vehicle miles driven is also increasing as far as people. And the more miles you drive, the more likely you are to get in a crash and different things like that. Obviously, if you got impairing substances, that's going to go up as well. So that those numbers were affected obviously by COVID as well. And that's not just here in Utah, but nationwide. Corona ruined everything as far as the tracking numbers and everything we saw. We saw an increase the last couple of years in fatal crashes. And they're looking at the different factors involved with that. So that kind of changed things, but our fatal numbers have gone down. Our alcohol related fatal numbers have gone down as well. So so the study that they did showed a decrease in that, so that they were showing that it had an effect on that. So was the change worth it? So our perspective as far as law enforcement. So like I mentioned, there were different things that I saw right away that changed. Number one, it was a lot harder for me to go out and find a DUI because people were being more responsible. They were getting a ride share, or they were, hey, I'm not gonna drive after drinking because, you know, the number one, that this law has changed. So I need to make a better decision. So we did notice that right away. And we do a lot of wet labs. So I'm over at our police academy. So we probably do 15 or 20 wet labs a year where we bring in volunteers and we dose them with alcohol. And, you know, the cadets practice the field sobriety tests on them while we're teaching them. And just talking to the volunteer drinkers too, I noticed a change in their attitudes and their behaviors, and they all mentioned it as well. That, yeah, you know, once this law went into effect, I had to change certain things and I had to do things differently. And that's what we want to happen. That's the desire we want, is to have that root change in behavior and decision making. So I did see an immediate effect on that. As far as the public as well, they had a lot of positive changes on that. Uber, Lyft, those uses have gone up a lot more. I would pull over cars and, you know, it'd be a Lyft driver, an Uber driver, or some kind of ride share, and they would have their person that had been consuming alcohol. And I was like, hey, good job. I appreciate you making a good decision, you know, and not getting behind the wheel and driving. I would rather pull those cars over all night than, you know, have to find a DUI because someone made a poor decision. So we did notice things like that. Unfortunately, you know, people still make bad decisions. So we're still out there arresting a lot of people, whether that's drugs or alcohol, that's impairing them. Okay, so the biggest change we can have is obviously on people's behavior. And the 05, the change that was the focus of it, was safety and behavior change and people's decision making. So has it changed the things that we've dealt with here? So Tyson mentioned a lot of the things that some of the people that were fighting against this change, and none of the arguments had changed at all from prior. You know, tourism, alcohol sales, all that stuff is going to go down. It's going to hurt the economy, different things like that. What we noticed, and even NHTSA did this with their study that they did of Utah and the change, it didn't change anything. Our tourism has actually gone up. Our alcohol consumption has gone up. Our alcohol sales have gone up. So none of that stuff that the doom and gloom they were saying was going to happen actually happened. Things got better. We have more vehicle miles traveled. Our fatal crashes have gone down, despite, you know, having more vehicle miles and more people on the roads, because our population has increased. So those things that they said, hey, this is bad, this is why it's bad, it didn't come to fruition, and we haven't seen any of that stuff happen. But we did see, like I mentioned, better decision making on the part of the public. Overall, I think obviously you still are going to have people that make poor decisions. I guess I could look at it as it's a good job security for us in law enforcement. Unfortunately, you're going to always have people that make bad decisions, so we're always going to be needed out there. You know, unless we get fully autonomous cars, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, and we're still going to have to deal with this problem because people will still make bad decisions. So the behavior change is the key to this, and that's how we got it to pass as far as the legislature. And we're focusing on public safety and the reasons why we're doing it, using that data in order to get this, the support and to get this to pass. So as far as the effects, I mentioned some of this. Utah was already one of the lowest in the nation as far as alcohol, DUI related crashes and things like that, because we have a lower number of people in the state that do consume alcohol. So it was already low. We lowered it even further. So any positive change is obviously good for us as far as our perspective in law enforcement. Our drug driving is higher than that. So we do have an issue with drugs and driving. So the key to that one is obviously teaching your officers and informing the public and educating them that drug driving, hey, that's a huge problem. Whether that's illegal drugs, prescription drugs, doesn't matter. Combining any of this stuff with alcohol, it's still a huge problem, and we're still seeing the effects of that. So focus on training those officers and getting that public educated on those. Even the worst thing that we have to do as law enforcement is those death notifications. Even if I can prevent that from happening even one time by having someone make a better decision, I'm not going to drive drunk or drive impaired, then that's one less person we have to go knock on the door of and tell someone that a loved one is dead because someone made a bad decision and chose to drive impaired. So if that's all we've done and that's all we've changed is to save one person's life, then I'm totally behind it and it's totally worth it. So anything that we can do to change that and change people's behavior, that's the most effective way. And I've got the studies and the numbers and things like that related to these. If our highway safety office actually just put some updated ones out just this week. So we've got some numbers that we're tracking and we've seen positive effects from this. And I appreciate the time that you've given me, and we'll open it up to any questions you guys might have.
Okay, at this time, I'm just gonna try and share my screen again. And get back into my PowerPoint as we go into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can type it in the Q&A. We do have a couple there. As you're doing that, also, if you could complete the survey, here's a QR code if you want to do it that way. Otherwise, there's, I think there's also a link to it in the chat box. The TZD leadership team does look at the results of these surveys and uses this information for future events. So we appreciate you taking some time to share your thoughts and ideas. Please note the next webinar is November 16th. So if you have any ideas for that, please let us know. We do have a couple of questions here in the chat. They'll just, okay, so question, does Utah use ignition interlock? Jared, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we certainly do. That's one of the sanctions that can get imposed through a conviction. If they're convicted of a DUI, then they'll be alcohol restricted driver. Also, ignition interlock can be put on there by either the driver's license or the court. So it kind of depends on how that conviction happens. If they refuse to any chemical test, then it's automatic. They're going to get that 18 months. They're going to get their license revoked, and then ignition interlock will have to be on there, and alcohol restricted, different sanctions as well. But the problem with the ignition interlock, and I don't know if it's the same in other states, it's really through the courts, so there's not a lot of follow on. Unless an officer pulls that person over again and they don't have it installed, then it's hard to track that as well.
Okay, the other question, I think Tyson had typed an answer in the chat. I don't know if we need to elaborate. The question was the yellow numbers that was in Tyson's slide, whether they were persons killed in alcohol-related crashes or the count of alcohol-related crashes. Tyson, I think you said that it was killed in alcohol-related crashes. I don't know if you had anything to add on that. Or
The crashes are up over 1,000. And I don't know the exact numbers. I just don't have those in front of me at the moment, but they're up over 1,000, whereas those fatalities are generally down around 40 or lower. So those were actual fatalities, not just number of crashes.
okay. The other question, has there been any attempt to separate alcohol caused crashes from incidental alcohol associated crashes? And is there an identifiable signal involving legal OTC and RX sedatives?
Jared, do you have any? I typed in there that I don't know the specific methodology and how they look at that. You might have more information when it comes to that.
I know that they have, so whenever there's a fatality involved, there's the state crime lab. They do an autopsy and then they separate the numbers. As far as that, we know a lot more about fatals than we do just crashes themselves. Obviously, it's the data that's input in there, so it's harder for the highway safety office to track those numbers, and you can talk to them a little bit more. They have the specifics, but we have tried to separate it. A lot of that is the crash reporting and what the officers put in their report. So it's harder to track those numbers. And there's a delay, obviously. A lot of times you have the alcohol numbers. They're doing a breath test or something pretty quickly. The drug numbers take a little bit longer to get those blood test results in. So unless the officer goes back in and updates those reports, then we don't have a lot of those numbers. So I'm sure it's the same other places that I've been as well, struggle with that as well. So they try to separate them. but it's hard unless there's a fatality involved.
Okay, another question. Was there any resistance from law enforcement that you had to overcome when moving to this law, either arguments against 05 or the new training or other topics?
There really wasn't, Jared. And your law enforcement, but I'll speak from the outside looking in at your profession with this. I'm sure there was individual officers who maybe had opinions, but overall law enforcement as a whole, especially when the bill sponsor and the legislature made clear, we're not expecting you to do anything different. We're not expecting you to go out and fix this by arresting a bunch of 05 drivers. Law enforcement was very much on board with this. They didn't have a problem with it at all.
Yeah, it was a pretty easy transition. So it basically all we did was change, December 30th, 2018, all it did was change from 08 to 05. So the officers continued to do the same things they were doing.
Another question, have you seen any connections or more appetite for increasing criminal penalties in Utah since moving to a .05?
Actually, we did actually, I didn't talk about this one, and Tyson might have a little more information, but last year, our legislature passed they changed the, so first time DUI arrest is a misdemeanor. The second time you get arrested for DUI, it bumps that misdemeanor up one level. And then the third time you get arrested for DUI, it bumps it up to a felony charge. So they did change that a little bit, where before, and these are all convictions within 10 years. So they did update that as well. As far as the penalties, they changed a couple of things regarding fatalities. If you kill somebody as a DUI driver, then they up those levels as well. So they have actually done that as well.
We've had several attempts to try and strengthen. Generally speaking, any appetite for increased jail time is frowned upon in the state of Utah right now. We're like probably a lot of other places around the country where we have criminal justice reform going on, and we don't have enough time to really dive into that topic here today. But what we have seen is there is an appetite in our legislature for repeat offenders. We have been able to really strengthen penalties when it comes to repeat offenders. Kind of the attitude is, well, anybody could get one. And I don't know that I agree with that, but that's kind of the attitude that I think they have for that first one. Let's give people a chance to show that it was just a mistake, and they'll fix their behavior. But what we have seen is we've been able to strengthen penalties across the board pretty well on repeat offenders over the last few years. So.
Any issues with testing, chemical testing, breath testing, for that lower level? Our lab reports like an uncertainty of measurement. And I'm assuming that would change at a lower level, but have you had any challenges to the testing or any issues come up there?
No, I haven't seen anything on my end. We did as a crew, because we're over the breath testing, obviously. We did do a couple of internal studies just to make sure that our toxicizers were reading at those lower levels. And I know that's part of your testing and certification of instruments and different things like that, depending on the state and the laws and things going on. But we didn't notice any differences as far as that goes. Prosecutors haven't had any issues as far as getting convictions based on those
Nope.
lower numbers as far as per se.
Okay. You mentioned your criminal refusal crime, that if they refuse, then you get a search warrant. Are you're doing search warrants for blood then on all those, or do you do instead of breath? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So if they refuse, so the officer can request one of four tests: breath, blood, urine, or oral fluids. So if the subject refuses, any of those tests, then they can be charged with that refusal. And our warrant system, it's electronic, it's online. There's a judge assigned that's, hey, this is your time, you're on call. So any officer that has a DUI, they just log into the system, type in their probable cause, send it off. I can get a warrant I've got them as fast as 5 minutes for a blood draw. So it's very easy to get a warrant as far as from the judge. I know a lot of states you got to do it telephonically. You actually have to go to have them sign it physically, but ours is very easy, very quick. It's been around for, 15 or so years. So it's a very good system. So it is, as long as the officer, has that arrest, they get that warrant, and the subject still refuses at that point, then we can charge them criminally with refusal, as well as the DUI as well. So they would get an additional charge. And the refusal one, obviously, it's easier for the prosecutor to convict on that refusal as well. They just say, hey, they refused. They were lawfully arrested, they refused. That's really all they need as far as the elements of the crime on that.
And Bill, I'll just follow up on that. The case that you are obviously very familiar with, Birchfield, we have to have that search warrant to be able to criminalize that refusal of a blood draw. So one of the elements we have to prove is that a judge had issued a warrant for the blood prior to their refusal for us to be able to charge that offense. And that's due to Birchfield.
Yeah, we obviously do the refusal crime. For blood, we, obviously have to get a warrant, but we make it a crime on the breath as well, but not getting a warrant. We're doing the electronic search warrants. We don't have, a statewide, sounded like you guys might have a statewide on-call judge for your e-warrants. We're not quite there yet, but obviously we do have a statewide e-warrant system to do that. So it sounds like you guys have some good things happening in Utah. So thanks, Jared and Tyson. I think that was all the questions that we had. Again, please do I just had another one pop up. Will the recording be shared? I miscalculated the time difference and came to the meeting late, and yes, it will. It'll be on the Minnesota TZD website. You can watch it later if you know somebody else interested in it. So yeah, again, please do the evaluation. I think I said the wrong date earlier. The next webinar for the traffic safety Hotdish is February 1st, 2023 at 10 a.m. Tim Johnson and talking about NHTSA's Vehicle Research and Test Center. So if you want to mark that on your calendars, you can. I think Linda had posted the NHTSA study. Jared or Tyson and Linda, I think, posted the NHTSA study in the chat. Linda also mentioned that the PDFs and video will be posted within 24 hours on the website. Thanks for attending. Thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar today. And thank you, Jared and Tyson, for the presentation today. And please follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And with that, I will go ahead and end the webinar.